scattered. At the front of the room stood Ms. Linda Harper, her perfectly pressed skirt and neat bun presenting an air of authority. She tapped a ruler lightly against the edge of her desk to gain the students' attention. "All right, everyone. Quiet down," she said, her tone clipped. The room gradually hushed, and Linda began her lecture. "Today, we're discussing the civil rights movement," she announced, writing the words in bold letters on the chalkboard. While it's often portrayed as a major turning point in American history, we must also look critically at its limitations. Economic progress, for instance, was driven more by industrial advancements than by marches or speeches. Caden Morris sat near the back, his textbook open and pencil poised. His dark eyes followed Linda as she spoke, his expression a mixture of curiosity and unease. He loved history, especially stories of people who stood up against the odds. But something about Ms. Harper's tone unsettled him. "The civil rights movement was symbolic," Linda continued, her voice calm but dismissive. "Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. played their part, but let's not overstate their impact. Change happens through economic growth and policy, not just ideals." Caden raised his hand, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "But didn't Martin Luther King help make life fairer for everyone? That's what my mum said." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. A few students glanced nervously at each other, while others stared at Caden, their faces a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Linda turned to face him, her expression neutral, though her lips pressed into a thin line. "Well," she said, her tone deliberately measured, "that might be what your family believes, Caden, but history shows otherwise. Economic changes were already underway before the movement gained traction." Caden's cheeks flushed, but he didn't back down. "But without the movement, wouldn't those changes have left people like us behind? My mom says the protests helped open doors for everyone." Linda's polite veneer began to crack. Her smile tightened, and her grip on the ruler in her hand stiffened. "Caden, history isn't about personal feelings or opinions. It's about facts. If you're here to learn, I suggest you focus on listening rather than questioning." The room grew quiet, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Caden's pulse quickened as he felt every eye in the room on him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his curiosity and sense of justice outweighed his fear. "I just don't think it's fair to say the movement didn't matter," he said quietly, but firmly. "People fought for their rights because they were being treated unfairly. That's important." Linda's patience snapped. She set down the ruler with a sharp click and took a step closer to Caden's desk. "Caden," she said, her voice low and clipped, "in the real world, not everyone's opinion matters equally. It's time you learn that." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Emily Carter, sitting 2 rows ahead, lowered her head, her face pale. She glanced briefly at Caden, guilt and discomfort etched across her features. Caden felt the sting of her words like a slap. His throat tightened and his hands gripped the edges of his desk. For a moment, he considered arguing further, but something in Linda's cold gaze told him it was pointless. "Leave the classroom," Linda commanded, her voice flat. "You can come back when you're ready to listen." Caden rose slowly, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor echoing louder than it should have. His classmates sat frozen, some exchanging nervous glances, others averting their eyes. As he gathered his notebook and walked toward the door, the weight of their stares pressed down on him like a heavy fog. His hand trembled slightly as he pushed the door open. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, the distant hum of other classes a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. As the door clicked shut behind him, Caden leaned against the cool cinder-block wall, his heart pounding in his chest. Back in the classroom, the tension lingered. Linda returned to her lecture as though nothing had happened, but her usual composure seemed strained. Emily sat rigid in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She replayed the scene in her mind, the way Caden's voice had wavered, the way Linda's words had cut so deeply. A part of her wanted to speak up, to say something to defend him, but fear rooted her in place. Across the room, a boy named Malik Washington stared out the window, his jaw clenched. Malik had seen this too many times before. People like Linda using their authority to silence voices they didn't want to hear. He felt a simmering anger in his chest, but like Emily, he remained silent. For the rest of the lesson, the classroom felt colder, the air heavy with unspoken thoughts. Linda continued her lecture, her words mechanical, her gaze avoiding the empty chair where Caden had sat. Caden stood in the hallway, his back pressed against the wall as he stared at the floor. His notebook dangled limply from his hand, the pages fluttering slightly with the air from the vents above. The harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the glossy linoleum, but their sterile glow couldn't warm the pit of cold anger and confusion in his chest. Why? Why had Ms. Harper treated him like that? Why did it feel like the whole world had stopped to watch him shrink under her words? Caden had always thought school was a place for questions, a place to learn and explore ideas. But today, it had felt more like a courtroom, with Ms. Harper as judge and jury. His thoughts churned as he replayed her words in his head. In the real world, not everyone's opinion matters equally. The phrase echoed in his mind, sharp and jagged. He clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palms. The faint hum of a nearby vending machine was the only sound, a stark contrast to the swirling storm inside him. He wanted to cry, but instead he swallowed hard and closed his eyes, trying to push the lump in his throat back down. Linda Harper continued her lecture, her voice even but lacking its usual vigor. She pointed at the chalkboard with a piece of chalk, outlining the timeline of economic growth in the mid-20th century, but her mind wandered to the confrontation. A part of her felt uneasy. Caden's words had lingered in the back of her mind, and she couldn't shake the uncomfortable notion that maybe she'd gone too far. But she quickly dismissed the thought, rationalizing her actions. A teacher's job is to maintain order, she reminded herself. He challenged my authority. That's not acceptable. Meanwhile, the students remained quiet, their usual chatter subdued. Emily Carter's pencil tapped rhythmically against her notebook, a nervous habit she couldn't seem to stop. She glanced at Caden's empty seat, her stomach twisting with guilt. She had wanted to say something. When Ms. Harper dismissed Caden's voice, Emily's own inner voice had screamed in protest. But fear had held her back, the fear of becoming a target herself, of losing the safety that came with staying silent. Across the room, Malik Washington shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He stared out the window, pretending not to notice the tension suffocating the classroom. But inside, his anger simmered. Malik knew what it was like to be dismissed, to feel invisible. And watching Caden go through it made his blood boil. The final bell rang, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a release valve. Chairs screeched against the floor as students gathered their things, eager to escape the suffocating energy that had plagued the room since Caden's departure. Emily lingered, her backpack slung over one shoulder as she debated whether to speak to Ms. Harper. She took a step toward the desk, but stopped when Linda looked up, her eyes meeting Emily's with a sharp, expectant gaze. The unspoken challenge in Ms. Harper's expression sent a chill down Emily's spine. She turned on her heel and left the room without saying a word. Caden didn't wait for the bell to signal the end of the day. He'd spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, his head buried in a book he wasn't really reading. When he finally left the building, the cool autumn air hit his face, grounding him slightly. The walk home was quiet. Caden's house wasn't far from the school, a modest duplex on the edge of town where the streets were lined with uneven sidewalks and towering oak trees. The crunch of fallen leaves beneath his sneakers was the only sound, a rhythmic backdrop to his swirling thoughts. He stopped at the base of the steps leading to his front door, staring at the chipped paint on the railing. The house had always felt like a refuge, a place where his mum's warm smile and comforting words could shield him from the world. But today, he wasn't sure if even that would be enough. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. In homes across Cedar Valley, whispers about the incident in Ms. Harper's class began to spread. Some parents heard about it from their children, who recounted the tension with wide-eyed curiosity. "She told him his opinion didn't matter," one boy told his mother at dinner. "It was weird, like she was really mad at him." Caden stood up for what he thought was right, Emily told her father, Daniel Carter, as they cleared the table after dinner. "And Ms. Harper, she just shut him down. It didn't feel fair." Daniel, a music teacher at the same school, frowned as he wiped his hands on a dish towel. "That doesn't sound like the kind of environment we want for our kids," he said thoughtfully. Emily hesitated. "Dad, do you think I should have said something?" Daniel paused, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's never easy to speak up in the moment," he said gently. "But the important thing is learning from it. If you feel like you can help, don't be afraid to try next time." The weight of the day hung heavily over Caden as he sat on the edge of his bed that evening. His mother's voice called from the kitchen, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at the scuffed tips of his sneakers, replaying the scene in his mind for what felt like the 100th time. He didn't know how to explain it, how the anger and shame tangled together, how the words, "not everyone's opinion matters equally," felt like they were branded into his chest. Finally, he stood and walked to the kitchen, where his mother was stirring a pot of soup. "Hey, baby," Felicia said with a tired but warm smile. "You okay?" Caden hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he admitted. Felicia's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet concern. She set the spoon down and knelt in front of him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "Talk to me," she said softly. And for the first time since he left the classroom, Caden began to speak. The walk home felt longer than usual. Caden kicked at a stray pebble on the sidewalk, watching it skitter ahead before bouncing into the gutter. The sky, once a brilliant canvas of orange and pink, had dimmed to a pale grey, and the air carried a sharp chill that bit through his thin jacket. He kept his head down, replaying the events of the day over and over in his mind. Ms. Harper's words echoed like a broken record. "Not everyone's opinion matters equally." Each repetition stung worse than the last, a reminder of the humiliation he'd felt under the gaze of his classmates. He clenched his fists in his pockets, his small frame trembling with a mixture of anger and confusion. By the time he reached the front steps of his house, a modest duplex with faded paint and a screen door that groaned when opened, the familiar sight of home should have been comforting. But tonight, even the warm glow of the living room lamp spilling onto the porch couldn't chase away the weight in his chest. Caden pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the scent of fried onions and something faintly sweet lingered in the air. His mother, Felicia, stood at the stove, her back to him as she stirred a pot. She still wore her uniform from the diner, a faded pink blouse and black slacks, slightly wrinkled after a long shift. "Hey, baby," she called without turning around, her voice warm but tinged with exhaustion. "How was school?" Caden didn't answer right away. Instead, he set his backpack on the floor by the door and towed off his sneakers. The quiet was enough to make Felicia glance over her shoulder, her brow furrowing as she took in her son's slumped posture and downcast eyes. "Caden," she said softly, setting the spoon down and turning toward him. "What's wrong?" Her question broke the dam. Caden's shoulders began to shake as tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Felicia moved quickly, kneeling in front of him and placing her hands gently on his arms. "Hey, hey," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. "It's okay. Take your time." Caden sniffed, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. "Mum," he finally managed, his voice cracking. "Why don't they like me? What did I do wrong?" Felicia felt her heart break. She pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as if she could shield him from the world. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her own eyes beginning to glisten. Felicia guided Caden to the small kitchen table, where she poured him a glass of water and sat across from him. He stared at the glass, his hands resting on the worn wooden surface, but he didn't drink. "What happened?" Felicia asked gently. Caden hesitated, his gaze fixed on the table. "It was Ms. Harper," he said quietly. "She was talking about the civil rights movement, and I said something about Martin Luther King Jr. I told her he helped make life fairer for everyone, but she said my opinion doesn't matter." Felicia inhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. "She said that." Caden nodded, tears brimming in his eyes again. "In front of everyone, she told me to leave the class." Felicia reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Her touch was firm but comforting, a silent promise that he wasn't alone. "Caden, listen to me," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You didn't do anything wrong. You stood up for what you believe in, and that's something to be proud of." "But it didn't matter," Caden whispered. "She made me feel like I'm nothing." Felicia's chest ached at his words, but she refused to let him sink into despair. She leaned forward, her tone softening. "Do you remember what your dad used to say?" Caden blinked, his brows furrowing slightly. "About kindness." Felicia smiled faintly. "That's right. He used to say, 'Kindness changes the world, even when it feels small.' Your dad faced people like Ms. Harper too, people who tried to make him feel small, who didn't want to hear his voice. But he didn't let them win. And neither will you." Caden looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. "What if it doesn't change anything, Mom?" Felicia squeezed his hand. "It might not change her, but it changes you. Every time you stand up for what's right, you're showing the world the kind of person you are. And that's what matters." For the first time that evening, a flicker of relief crossed Caden's face. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve again, this time with a bit more resolve. "Dad wouldn't give up, would he?" "No," Felicia said firmly, "and neither will we." They sat in silence for a moment, the steady hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet space. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Felicia stood and moved back to the stove, stirring the pot on the burner. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her tone lighter now. "Why don't you set the table, huh?" Caden nodded, sliding out of his chair. As he retrieved plates and silverware from the cabinet, the weight on his chest began to lift, if only slightly. His mom's words echoed in his mind, grounding him. Kindness changes the world, even when it feels small. For the first time since leaving school, Caden felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as powerless as Ms. Harper had made him feel. The next morning, Felicia Morris parked her worn sedan in the lot of Cedar Valley Middle School. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. The weight of the previous night lingered in her chest, Caden's tears, his trembling voice as he recounted Ms. Harper's words. It had taken everything in her not to let her anger spill over in front of him. But this morning, she was determined. Caden was her world, and no one, especially not a teacher, was going to make him feel like he didn't matter. She grabbed her purse, straightened her jacket, and stepped out of the car. The crisp autumn air bit at her cheeks, but the chill did little to cool the fire burning inside her. Felicia approached the front desk, where the school secretary, a woman in her 50s with kind but tired eyes, looked up with a polite smile. "Good morning," Felicia said, her voice firm but controlled. "I need to speak with Ms. Harper." The secretary hesitated. "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" "No, I don't," Felicia replied, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "But it's urgent." Before the secretary could respond, the door to the teacher's lounge opened and Linda Harper stepped out, a coffee mug in hand. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Felicia, but she quickly recovered, her expression shifting to one of polite indifference. "Ms. Morris," Linda said, her tone cool. "What brings you here?" Felicia didn't waste any time. "I need to talk to you about what happened in your classroom yesterday," she said, stepping closer. Linda glanced at the secretary, then back at Felicia. "I'm afraid I have a class to prepare for, but—" "This won't take long," Felicia interrupted, her voice sharp. Linda sighed, setting her mug on the desk. "Fine, let's talk." The two women moved to a quieter corner of the hallway. Linda crossed her arms, her expression composed, but with a hint of impatience. "Ms. Harper," Felicia began, her tone steady but laced with anger, "I want to know why you felt it was appropriate to humiliate my son in front of his classmates." Linda blinked, her composure faltering for a brief moment before she replied, "I handled the situation professionally. Caden was being disruptive." "He wasn't being disruptive," Felicia shot back, her voice rising slightly. "He asked a question. He challenged your perspective. That's what kids are supposed to do in school, ask questions, engage with what they're being taught." Linda's lips tightened. Perhaps Caden should focus on following instructions rather than challenging authority. Felicia's jaw clenched. "You told my son that his opinion doesn't matter. Do you have any idea what kind of damage that does to a child?" "Ms. Morris," Linda said, her voice icy, "I have been teaching for over a decade. I know how to manage my classroom, and I don't appreciate being accused of something so inflammatory." "Inflammatory?" Felicia repeated, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "You dismissed his voice because of who he is. You made him feel like he's less than his classmates. That's not just inappropriate, Ms. Harper. It's harmful." Linda glanced around, as if worried someone might overhear. "I suggest you take this up with the administration if you have concerns. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a class to teach." Felicia took a step closer, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over," she said quietly but firmly. Linda didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Felicia standing alone in the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. After her confrontation with Linda, Felicia marched straight to the principal's office. She knocked on the door and was greeted by Principal Richard Cole, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and a reputation for avoiding conflict whenever possible. "Ms. Morris," Cole said, gesturing for her to sit. "What can I do for you?" Felicia didn't waste time. "I'm here to file a formal complaint against Ms. Harper. What she said to my son yesterday was unacceptable, and I expect it to be addressed immediately." Cole leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the desk. "I understand your concerns, but I've spoken with Ms. Harper, and she assures me that she handled the situation appropriately." Felicia's eyes narrowed. "Appropriately? She humiliated my son in front of his classmates. She told him his opinion didn't matter." Cole sighed, his tone turning patronizing. "Without concrete proof, it's difficult to take action. Ms. Harper has been an excellent teacher for years, and I see no reason to doubt her professionalism." Felicia's hands tightened into fists in her lap. "So you're just going to take her word for it? You're not even going to talk to the students who were in the room?" Cole adjusted his tie, avoiding her gaze. "We have protocols for handling complaints, Ms. Morris. If more information comes to light, we'll revisit the matter. But as of now, There's nothing more I can do." Felicia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You mean there's nothing you're willing to do?" she said, her voice sharp. "Because protecting your staff is more important than protecting your students." "Ms. Morris," Cole said, his tone firm, "I suggest you calm down." Felicia leaned over the desk, her voice steady but laced with anger. "Don't tell me to calm down. My son deserves better than this." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the office, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Felicia exited the principal's office, her heart pounding and her frustration boiling over. As she walked down the corridor, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her chest. She had confronted both Linda Harper and Principal Cole, yet all she had received were dismissals and excuses. The people who were supposed to protect her son had failed him and her. She pushed open the double doors of the school and stepped into the cool autumn air, her breath visible in the crisp breeze. Across the street, a group of parents stood chatting near the playground. Felicia recognized Chloe Davidson among them, a tall, impeccably dressed woman with a commanding presence. Chloe had always been involved in school activities, her voice often carrying weight in PTA meetings and parent discussions. As Felicia crossed the parking lot, she caught snippets of their conversation. "I heard about the little incident in Ms. Harper's class," Chloe said, her voice carrying a smug undertone. "Apparently, Caden's mother is making a big deal out of nothing. Poor Ms. Harper doesn't deserve to be dragged through the mud over a simple misunderstanding." Another parent hesitated before responding. "I don't know, Chloe. If what they're saying is true, it sounds serious." Chloe scoffed, adjusting her pearl necklace. "It's typical. Some people are always looking for something to complain about, even when it's their own child who's at fault." Felicia stopped in her tracks, her hands trembling with anger. She wanted to march over there and set the record straight, to tell Chloe exactly what had happened in that classroom and how much pain it had caused her son. But as she stood there, watching the group laugh and gossip, she realized that confronting them would only fan the flames. Later that afternoon, Felicia sat in the small cafe where she often stopped after work, her untouched coffee growing cold in front of her. She stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The sound of the bell above the door brought her back to reality. She turned to see a familiar face, Daniel Carter, the music teacher from Cedar Valley, walking in. He noticed her and hesitated for a moment before approaching her table. "Ms. Morris," he said with a tentative smile, "do you mind if I join you?" Felicia gestured to the seat across from her. "Please." Daniel sat down, his expression thoughtful. "I heard about what happened with Caden in Ms. Harper's class. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened." Felicia felt a lump rise in her throat. It was the first time since the incident that someone from the school had shown genuine empathy. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've tried everything. Talking to Linda, meeting with the principal, but it feels like no one cares." Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I care. Caden is a bright kid. He deserves to feel valued, not dismissed. And you're not alone in this. There are other parents, other teachers who feel the same way. They're just afraid to speak up." Felicia frowned. "Afraid of what?" "People like Chloe Davidson," Daniel admitted. "She has influence, and she uses it to control the narrative. But that doesn't mean you should stop fighting." Felicia sighed, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. It's hard to keep fighting when it feels like the whole system is against you. Daniel's gaze was steady. "Sometimes it takes just one voice to make a difference. And you've got a strong one, Ms. Morris." Over the next few days, the story began to spread throughout the town. Felicia noticed the subtle shifts in how people treated her. Some parents avoided her at the grocery store, their polite smiles replaced with tight-lipped nods. Others whispered behind her back, their glances sharp and judgmental. But not everyone kept their distance. At the church on Sunday, Felicia and Caden were greeted warmly by Pastor James Coleman, a kind-hearted man who had known their family for years. After the service, he pulled Felicia aside. "I heard about what happened at school," he said gently, "and I want you to know that you and Caden are in our prayers. If there's anything we can do to support you, just say the word." Felicia smiled faintly. "Thank you, Pastor. It means a lot." Another surprise came from Emily Carter, the daughter of Daniel Carter. She approached Caden hesitantly during lunch one day, her cheeks flushed with nerves. "Hey, Caden," she said, clutching her lunch tray. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about what happened in class. It wasn't fair, and if you ever need help with anything, I'm here." Caden was taken aback, but managed a small smile. "Thanks, Emily." That evening, Felicia sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. The screen displayed the email she had drafted for the school district superintendent, detailing the events in Linda Harper's class and the lack of action from Principal Cole. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she reread the email for the third time. Part of her feared retaliation, but another part of her, the part that had held Caden as he cried, the part that had seen his confidence waver, knew she couldn't back down. With a deep breath, she clicked, "Send." Caden appeared in the doorway, watching her silently. "Mom," he said after a moment, "why do you keep doing this? Don't you get tired?" Felicia turned to him, her expression soft but determined. "I do get tired, baby, but I'll never get tired of standing up for you." Caden's eyes glistened, and he gave her a small nod. "Thanks, Mom." She smiled and pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. "We'll get through this," she whispered. "Together." The sunlight filtered through the music room's large windows, casting soft shadows on the rows of chairs and stands scattered throughout the space. The faint smell of sheet music and polished wood lingered in the air, mingling with the soft hum of an upright piano in the corner. Daniel Carter stood at the front of the room, adjusting the tuning on a violin. The music teacher was known for his calm demeanor and encouraging smile, traits that had endeared him to generations of students. Today, however, his smile was tinged with concern. He'd heard about the incident in Ms. Harper's classroom from both Emily and whispers among the faculty. While he wasn't one to get involved in school politics, something about the story had unsettled him deeply. As Caden walked hesitantly into the room, Daniel straightened, his expression softening. "Caden, come on in," he said warmly. Caden shuffled inside, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He glanced around the room, unsure of why he'd been called there. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Carter?" "Yes," Daniel said, gesturing to a chair near the piano. "Have a seat." Caden obeyed, placing his backpack on the floor. His small frame seemed to shrink further under Daniel's steady gaze. "I heard about what happened in Ms. Harper's class," Daniel began carefully, "and I wanted to check in with you. How are you holding up?" Caden looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. "I'm okay, I guess," he mumbled. It feels like no matter what I say or do, it doesn't matter. Like she already decided I was wrong before I even said anything." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Caden, sometimes people don't want to hear what they don't understand, but that doesn't mean your voice doesn't matter. In fact, it's even more important to speak up when it feels like no one's listening." Caden glanced up at him, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "But how do you do that when it feels so hard?" A smile tugged at the corners of Daniel's lips. "Well, for me, it's through music." Caden tilted his head. "Music?" "Music has a way of expressing things words can't," Daniel explained. It's a way to tell your story, to let people see who you are without having to explain it all. And I think you have a story worth sharing." Caden blinked, caught off guard. "Me? But I don't even play an instrument." "Not yet," Daniel said with a grin. "But I'd like to help you change that. We've got a music club that meets after school, and I think you'd be a great addition. No pressure, just a place to try something new and see if it feels right." Caden hesitated, the weight of doubt still heavy on his shoulders. But Daniel's encouraging gaze was unwavering, and for the first time in days, Caden felt a glimmer of hope. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "Take your time," Daniel replied. "Just know that the door's always open." That afternoon, Caden sat alone at lunch, poking at the food on his tray. The cafeteria buzzed with chatter and laughter, but he felt like he was in a bubble, isolated from the noise around him. "Hey, Caden," a hesitant voice said from behind him. He turned to see Emily Carter, her cheeks flushed as she clutched her lunch tray. She looked nervous but determined as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Can I sit here?" she asked. Caden shrugged. "Sure." Emily slid into the seat across from him, setting her tray down carefully. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the awkward silence stretching between them. Finally, Emily took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but earnest. Caden frowned, confused. "Sorry? For what?" "For not saying anything in class," Emily admitted, her gaze dropping to the table. "I saw what happened and I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't do anything. I was scared and that's not an excuse, but I just wanted you to know I'm sorry." Caden stared at her, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to apologize, let alone Emily. "It's okay," he said after a moment. "I mean, it's not okay what happened, but I get it. It's hard to speak up." Emily looked up, relief washing over her face. "Thanks," she said. "And if you ever need someone to talk to or, I don't know, someone to sit with at lunch, I'm here." A small smile tugged at Caden's lips. "Thanks, Emily." As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Emily stood to leave but paused. "Oh, and one more thing," she said, turning back to Caden. "My dad's the music teacher. He said you might join the music club?" Caden nodded slowly. "He mentioned it." "You should do it," Emily said, her tone sincere. "It's really fun, and my dad's pretty cool, for a teacher anyway." Caden chuckled, the first genuine laugh he'd had in days. "I'll think about it." As Emily walked away, Caden felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since the incident, he didn't feel completely alone. The following Sunday, the soft hum of a gospel choir resonated through the small church, where Felicia and Caden attended service each week. The modest building, with its wooden pews and stained glass windows, had always been a sanctuary for them, a place of solace and strength. After the final hymn, Pastor James Coleman stepped to the front, his warm, steady voice carrying across the congregation. He spoke of perseverance, of faith in the face of adversity, and of standing up for what is right, even when the path feels uncertain. As the congregation filed out, Pastor Coleman lingered near the door, greeting each person with a smile and a handshake. When Felicia and Caden approached, his expression softened. "Sister Morris," he said warmly, taking Felicia's hand. "Caden." He knelt slightly to meet Caden's eyes. "How are you doing, young man?" Caden hesitated, glancing at his mother. "I'm okay," he said quietly. Pastor Coleman's gaze remained steady. "I heard about what happened at school," he said gently. "And I want you to know something, son. Your voice matters. Don't ever let anyone make you believe otherwise." Caden blinked, his eyes glistening. "But it doesn't feel like it matters. Ms. Harper doesn't listen. The principal doesn't care. What's the point?" Pastor Coleman placed a hand on Caden's shoulder, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Sometimes, the point isn't to make them listen right away. It's to remind yourself that you deserve to be heard. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with someone brave enough to stand up and say, "This isn't right." Caden nodded slowly, the pastor's words settling into his heart like a seed planted in fertile soil. Felicia, standing beside him, felt a swell of gratitude. "Thank you, Pastor," she said softly. "Any time," he replied. "And remember, you're not alone. This community is here for you. If you need support, legal advice, connections, anything, you let me know." Felicia smiled, her resolve strengthening. "We'll keep that in mind." That evening, Caden sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open in front of him. He wasn't doing homework, though. Instead, he was sketching ideas for a song, scribbled words and phrases, lines crossed out and rewritten. His thoughts kept drifting back to what Pastor Coleman and Mr. Carter had said, music as a way to tell his story. Felicia walked into the room holding 2 mugs of tea. She set one down in front of Caden and sat across from him. "What are you working on?" she asked. Caden hesitated, then pushed the notebook toward her. "It's just an idea for a song. Mr. Carter said I should try the music club, and I was thinking, maybe this could be something I could work on there." Felicia flipped through the pages, her heart swelling with pride as she read the words. "This is beautiful, Caden. You've got a gift." Caden blushed, ducking his head. "I don't know if it's any good." "It's more than good," Felicia said firmly. "And I think you should go for it. Don't let what happened with Ms. Harper stop you from showing the world what you can do." Caden nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think I will." The next day, Caden walked into the music room after school, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. The room was filled with the soft sounds of instruments being tuned and the low murmur of students chatting. Daniel Carter spotted him and grinned. "Hey, Caden, glad you decided to give it a try." Caden nodded shyly, stepping further into the room. Emily waved at him from across the room, her smile encouraging. Daniel handed him a pair of drumsticks and motioned toward a practice pad. "Let's start with something simple. No pressure. Just have fun with it." As Caden sat down and began to experiment with the rhythm, a sense of ease washed over him. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope, a spark of excitement for what lay ahead. And as he tapped out a steady beat, he realized something important. His voice might have been dismissed by Ms. Harper, but here, in this room, with these people, it mattered. Linda Harper sat in her living room, the soft glow of a table lamp casting shadows on the stack of papers in front of her. Across from her, Chloe Davidson sipped a glass of wine, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the glass. Chloe's expression was a mix of confidence and disdain, her voice dripping with authority. "Linda," Chloe began, "this situation with Caden is getting out of hand. That mother of his is making waves, and it's only a matter of time before people start digging where they shouldn't." Linda sighed, rubbing her temples. "I've done everything by the book, Chloe. The boy was disruptive. I handled it professionally." "Handled it?" Chloe raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp. "The whole school is talking about it. That's not handling it. And now he's in this music competition. People are already questioning the school's judgment, and if he wins, they'll call it favoritism." Linda frowned. "He hasn't won anything yet." "Exactly," Chloe said, leaning forward. "And we're going to make sure he doesn't. I've already spoken to a few people on the committee. We'll frame it as a question of fairness, make it about maintaining the integrity of the competition. Caden Morris is an untrained child who doesn't belong there." Linda hesitated, her stomach twisting with unease. "Do you really think that's necessary?" Chloe's gaze hardened. Do you want this to go away or not? Linda nodded reluctantly. Fine. What do you need me to do? 2 days later, Caden sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open as he worked on a melody for the competition. The notes were scratched and rewritten, the pages smudged with eraser marks. Despite the challenges, he felt a flicker of hope every time he looked at the growing piece. The knock at the door broke his concentration. Felicia walked over to answer it, a friendly smile on her face that quickly faded when she saw the mailman handing her an envelope marked with the school's logo. "What is it, Mom?" Caden asked, setting down his pencil. Felicia opened the envelope, her brows furrowing as she read the letter inside. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the paper on the table in front of Caden. He picked it up, scanning the words quickly. His heart sank. "We regret to inform you that due to concerns raised about eligibility, your participation in the upcoming music competition has been revoked." Caden stared at the letter, his hands tightening into fists. "They're kicking me out?" Felicia's jaw clenched, her eyes blazing with anger. "They can't do this. You earned your spot fair and square." "They don't care," Caden said bitterly, his voice cracking. "They never wanted me there in the first place." Felicia knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're not going to let them get away with this, Caden. You hear me? This isn't over." The next morning, Emily Carter sat in the school cafeteria, scrolling through her phone. She couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that had been nagging her ever since Caden was removed from the competition. She knew it wasn't fair. He'd worked so hard, and now it felt like everything was stacked against him. Her thumb hovered over the record button in her camera app as she thought back to the day in Ms. Harper's classroom. She'd hesitated then, too afraid to speak up. But now, maybe this was her chance to make it right. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching before opening her photo library. There, hidden among dozens of pictures and videos, was the clip she'd recorded that day in class. Emily hit play, her stomach churning as she listened to Ms. Harper's cutting words. "Not everyone's opinion matters equally." She hesitated for only a moment before uploading the video to a private group chat. Within minutes, one of her friends shared it on a local community page. By the time Emily got home that evening, the video had already been shared dozens of times. The video spread like wildfire, its impact rippling far beyond Cedar Valley Middle School. Parents, teachers, and community members flooded social media with comments, many expressing outrage at Ms. Harper's behavior. "This is unacceptable," one comment read. "A teacher should never speak to a student this way." "Caden deserves an apology," another wrote, "and Linda Harper needs to be held accountable." Felicia sat at the kitchen table, her phone buzzing with notifications. She scrolled through the messages, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and anger. People were finally listening. Caden sat beside her, watching the reactions unfold. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" he asked quietly. Felicia placed a hand over his. "I think it already has," she said. Meanwhile, Linda Harper sat in her classroom, her face pale as she stared at her phone. The video had been forwarded to her by a colleague, and the backlash was already pouring in. Her email inbox was flooded with complaints, and she'd received a tense call from Principal Cole demanding, "Linda," Chloe's voice crackled through the phone when she called for advice, "this isn't as bad as it looks. We just need to ride it out." "Ride it out," Linda snapped. "My career is on the line, Chloe." "Stay calm," Chloe said. "This will blow over. Just don't say anything until we figure out a response." Linda hung up, her hands shaking. She could feel the walls closing in, the carefully constructed facade of her professional reputation beginning to crack. As the week progressed, the video continued to gain traction, drawing attention from local news outlets and advocacy groups. Parents began showing up at school board meetings, demanding answers and accountability. Felicia, standing at the center of the growing movement, felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time, it seemed like people were finally willing to fight alongside her and Caden. But the fight was far from over. As Felicia watched Caden work on his song late into the night, she knew they still had a long way to go. "Keep going, baby," she whispered softly. "We're not done yet." Harrison James leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of the newsroom filling the space around him. At 28, he was one of the youngest reporters at the Cedar Valley Gazette, known for his tenacity and knack for uncovering the human stories behind local controversies. As he scrolled through his social media feed, his gaze landed on a viral video. Ms. Harper's voice rang out, sharp and dismissive, her words cutting through the classroom silence. Not everyone's opinion matters equally. Harrison paused the video, his brow furrowed. The caption below read, "Teacher humiliates black student in front of class. Is this what we call education?" The reporter in him sparked to life. He'd heard rumblings about the situation at Cedar Valley Middle School. A child removed from a music competition, whispers of discrimination. But this video brought it all into sharp focus. Harrison pulled up a fresh document on his laptop, fingers poised over the keyboard. By the time Harrison finished his article, the sun had set, casting long shadows across his desk. The piece was sharp, yet balanced, weaving together the details of Caden's story with quotes from education experts and civil rights advocates. Caden Morris, a sixth grader at Cedar Valley Middle School, was recently removed from a local music competition under unclear circumstances. This decision followed a classroom incident in which his teacher, Linda Harper, was caught on video dismissing his voice in a way many are calling discriminatory. The video has since gone viral, sparking outrage among parents and educators alike. Harrison included a brief interview with Felicia Morris, who spoke about her son's passion for learning and the pain he'd endured. Her words carried the raw emotion of a mother fighting for her child's future. "He's just a kid who wanted to learn, to express himself," Felicia had said, her voice steady despite the strain. And instead of being encouraged, he was silenced. The article concluded with a call to action, urging the community to stand up for fairness and inclusivity in schools. Satisfied, Harrison hit send, forwarding the piece to his editor. He leaned back, a sense of purpose settling over him. This wasn't just a story, it was a chance to make a difference. The next morning, Felicia's phone buzzed incessantly. As she sipped her coffee, she scrolled through a flood of messages and notifications. Harrison's article had gone live, and it was everywhere. Parents shared the link across social media platforms, their comments filled with outrage and calls for change. Advocacy groups from neighboring towns began to chime in, offering support and resources. At the grocery store, Felicia noticed strangers giving her nods of encouragement. One woman approached her, placing a hand on her arm. "I read the article," she said softly. "You're so brave. Caden's lucky to have a mom like you." Felicia smiled, though the weight of the battle ahead still pressed on her shoulders. By mid-afternoon, a group of parents had gathered in the town square, holding signs with messages like "Justice for Caden" and "Equality in Education." The group, initially small, quickly grew as more people joined, their voices rising in unison. One of the organizers, Sarah Bishop, a mother of 3 and longtime community activist, stepped up to the makeshift podium. "We cannot allow this to stand," she declared, her voice strong and unwavering. "Caden deserves the same opportunities as any other child. It's time we demand accountability and fairness in our schools." The crowd cheered, their energy palpable. Meanwhile, Harrison continued to cover the story, sharing updates on the growing movement. He interviewed parents, students, and community leaders, painting a vivid picture of a town rallying together to demand change. The organizing committee for the music competition couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. Emails flooded their inboxes, and their social media accounts were inundated with messages calling for Caden's reinstatement. Behind closed doors, the members debated fiercely. Some argued that reversing their decision would set a dangerous precedent, while others insisted that the evidence, both the video and the community's response, was too compelling to ignore. "We have to do something," one member finally said. "This isn't just about the competition anymore. It's about what's right." At home, Caden sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open before him. The past few days had been overwhelming, but the outpouring of support from the community gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Felicia placed a hand on his shoulder. "How's the song coming along?" Caden smiled faintly. "Almost done. I want it to be perfect." "It doesn't have to be perfect," Felicia said gently. "It just has to be yours." Caden nodded, his resolve strengthening. No matter what happened, he would be ready. 2 days later, Felicia received a call from Sarah Bishop. "The committee is meeting tomorrow," Sarah said, "and we've been invited to speak on Caden's behalf. Are you up for it?" Felicia's heart raced. "Absolutely," she said. The next day, Felicia, Caden, and a small group of supporters stood before the committee, their voices steady as they made their case. Felicia spoke about her son's passion for music and the unfairness of the decision to remove him. Sarah highlighted the broader implications of the situation, urging the committee to set an example of fairness and inclusivity. When it was Caden's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the podium. "All I want is a chance," he said simply. "A chance to show what I can do." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The day of the music competition arrived, bringing with it a swirl of emotions in the Morris household. Caden stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt for what felt like the 100th time. His hands trembled slightly, a mix of nerves and excitement coursing through him. In the kitchen, Felicia prepared breakfast, though her appetite was nowhere to be found. She glanced at the clock, then at the open music notebook sitting on the table, the same notebook Caden had poured his heart into over the past few weeks. "Caden," she called, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "It's time to go." Caden emerged, clutching his notebook like a lifeline. He paused by the door, looking at his mother with wide, uncertain eyes. What if they don't like it?" Felicia knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "Baby, this isn't about them liking it," she said gently. "This is about you showing them who you are. And who you are is more than enough." Daniel Carter met them at the school's auditorium where the competition was being held. He offered Caden a reassuring smile, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've got this, Caden. Just breathe and let the music speak for you." Emily was there too, standing off to the side with her father. "You're going to be amazing," she said quietly, giving Caden a thumbs up. Caden nodded, swallowing hard as he clutched his notebook tighter. The auditorium was packed, the hum of voices filling the air as the competition began. Caden waited backstage, his heart pounding in his chest as the announcer called out each performer. Finally, his name echoed through the room. Caden Morris, performing an original composition. A hush fell over the audience as Caden stepped onto the stage, his small frame dwarfed by the grand piano that stood waiting for him. He took a deep breath, his fingers trembling slightly as he positioned them over the keys. For a moment, everything was still. Then he began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, but they quickly grew in strength and confidence. The melody he'd crafted was raw and emotional, a reflection of his journey, moments of struggle and pain interwoven with threads of hope and resilience. The audience watched in rapt silence, the weight of the music washing over them like a tide. Caden's fingers danced across the keys, each note carrying a piece of his heart. As the song reached its crescendo, the room seemed to hold its breath, the final chord ringing out like a declaration. For a moment after the music stopped, there was nothing but silence. Caden's chest rose and fell as he sat frozen at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys. He glanced nervously at the audience, unsure of what to expect. Then, the first clap broke the stillness. It was hesitant at first, but it quickly grew, spreading through the room like wildfire. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, the applause thunderous and unwavering. Caden's eyes widened, his heart pounding in a different rhythm now. He stood slowly, blinking back tears as he took in the sea of faces cheering for him. Felicia watched from the front row, her own cheeks wet with tears as she clapped with all her might. Beside her, Daniel beamed with pride, and Emily's smile stretched from ear to ear. After the applause subsided, the panel of judges whispered among themselves, their expressions serious but impressed. The head judge, a seasoned musician with decades of experience, finally leaned into the microphone. "Caden Morris," he began, his voice steady but warm, "you've reminded us all tonight of the power of music, not just as an art form, but as a way to connect, to heal, and to inspire. Your performance was nothing short of extraordinary." Caden's breath hitched, his hands trembling at his sides as the judge continued. "It is with great honor that we award you first place in this competition." The room erupted into cheers once more, the sound almost deafening. Caden looked out into the crowd, his eyes locking with his mother's. Her smile told him everything he needed to know. As the competition ended and the crowd began to disperse, Caden found himself surrounded by a flurry of handshakes and congratulations. "You were incredible," Emily said, her voice brimming with excitement. Daniel crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Remember this feeling, Caden," he said. "You've earned it." Felicia pulled him into a tight hug, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, baby. You did it." Caden smiled through his tears, the weight of the past few weeks lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt seen, truly seen, for who he was and what he could do. Linda Harper sat in her office, the once familiar space now feeling like a cage. The blinds were drawn, and the muted hum of the school day outside only deepened the silence inside. She stared at her computer screen, an email from Principal Richard Cole glaring back at her. "Linda, following the viral video and community backlash, the district has decided to place you on immediate administrative leave. You will also be required to attend a series of cultural sensitivity and inclusion training sessions before any discussion of your return can occur." Her stomach churned as she read the words again. Despite Chloe Davidson's reassurances, the pressure from the community had become impossible to ignore. Emails, phone calls, even local news coverage painted a picture of Linda as the epitome of outdated and discriminatory practices. She leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. She had always considered herself a fair teacher, someone who maintained order and discipline. But now those very qualities were being scrutinized, twisted into evidence of prejudice. Or were they? A quiet voice in the back of her mind asked the question she had been avoiding. What if they're right? The official announcement of Linda's suspension spread quickly through the community. Parents exchanged knowing glances at school drop-offs, and students whispered about it between classes. Felicia Morris heard the news during her shift at the diner, where one of the regular customers mentioned it offhandedly. "They finally did something about that Harper woman," the man said, shaking his head. "About time, too." Felicia felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. While the decision didn't erase the harm Linda had caused, it was a step toward accountability. Still, she knew the fight wasn't over, not for Caden, and not for the countless others who had endured similar experiences. At home, Linda found herself alone with her thoughts. Chloe had stopped answering her calls, and her once full calendar was now painfully empty. She sat in her living room, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, a recommended link blinking on the screen. Caden Morris's winning performance, a triumph of talent and resilience. Linda hesitated, her finger hovering over the trackpad. Finally, she clicked the link. The video began with Caden stepping onto the stage, his small frame almost swallowed by the grandeur of the piano. Linda watched as he adjusted the seat, his hands trembling slightly before they found their place on the keys. As the first notes rang out, Linda's breath caught in her throat. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with raw emotion and unspoken words. Each note seemed to carry the weight of Caden's journey, his pain, his determination, his hope. Linda felt a lump rise in her throat as the camera panned to the audience, capturing their rapt expressions. She watched as the judges leaned forward, their faces softening with admiration. When the performance ended, the standing ovation was thunderous, and Caden's wide-eyed expression of disbelief tugged at something deep within her. For the first time, Linda truly saw Caden, not as a student she had dismissed, but as a boy who had fought to be heard. Linda closed her laptop, her hands shaking. The silence of her living room felt heavier now, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Memories of that day in the classroom flooded back. She could hear her own voice, cold and dismissive, cutting through the room. Not everyone's opinion matters equally. How many times had she said things like that? How many students had she silenced without even realizing it? Linda pressed her hands to her face, a wave of guilt washing over her. For so long, she had prided herself on maintaining control, on teaching her students to respect authority. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped listening to them. The next morning, Linda sat in the lobby of the district office, waiting for her first inclusion training session. She clutched a notebook and pen, her nerves frayed as she glanced around the room. A poster on the wall caught her eye. Diversity is strength, building inclusive classrooms for the future. The irony wasn't lost on her. The session began with an introduction from the facilitator, a woman named Dr. Angela Brooks. Today, we're going to talk about the impact of implicit bias in education, Dr. Brooks said, her tone warm but firm. This isn't about blame, it's about growth. Linda listened quietly, her pen hovering over the blank page in front of her. The stories shared by the other participants, stories of missed opportunities, of harm caused unintentionally, resonated in a way she hadn't expected. When it was her turn to speak, Linda hesitated. Finally, she said, "I thought I was being fair. I thought I was maintaining order. But I see now that I was shutting down voices that deserved to be heard. I didn't realize the harm I was causing." Dr. Brooks nodded. "Awareness is the first step, Ms. Harper. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with acknowledgement." Later that evening, Linda sat in her car outside the school, staring at the building where she had spent so many years teaching. It looked different now, less like a fortress of authority and more like a place filled with possibilities she had ignored. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Felicia Morris. "Dear Ms. Morris, I've been reflecting on my actions and the harm I caused your son. I'm deeply sorry. I would like to meet with you and Caden to apologize in person, if you're willing. I understand if you're not ready for that, but please know that I am committed to making things right." She hit send, her heart pounding. The weeks following the music competition were a whirlwind of change. Caden's triumphant performance became the centerpiece of community conversations, not just for its musical brilliance, but for what it represented: resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. At school, Caden walked through the hallways with a newfound confidence. Students greeted him with nods and smiles, and even those who had once stayed silent now showed their support in small but meaningful ways. Emily Carter was a constant companion, her friendship a reminder that even in the darkest times, allies could emerge. But perhaps the most surprising development came from Linda Harper. One Friday morning, Caden and Felicia were called to the school's library for a meeting. When they arrived, they found Principal Cole, Linda Harper, and Dr. Angela Brooks, the facilitator from Linda's inclusion training, waiting for them. Linda stood as they entered, her usual composure replaced by a visible vulnerability. "Caden, Ms. Morris," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you for meeting with me." Felicia crossed her arms but nodded. "We're here to listen." Linda took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I want to apologize for my words, for my actions, and for the harm I caused. I see now that I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I failed to see you, Caden, for who you truly are. I'm so sorry." Caden looked up at his mother, his expression uncertain. Felicia's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Caden," she said gently, "it's your call." Caden turned back to Linda, his voice clear but firm. "I accept your apology," he said, "but I hope you'll use this to make things better for other kids too." Linda nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I will. Thank you for giving me the chance to do better." The reconciliation didn't end with Linda's apology. Under the leadership of Sarah Bishop and Pastor Coleman, the community launched an initiative to promote inclusivity and equity in local schools. Workshops, parent-teacher forums, and student-led discussions became regular occurrences, creating a space where everyone's voice could be heard. Caden became a quiet hero in the town, his story inspiring others to speak up and demand change. He continued to hone his musical talents, performing at community events and sharing his compositions with growing confidence. At one such event, a benefit concert to raise funds for educational programs, Caden stood on stage, his mother beaming from the front row. The crowd fell silent as he introduced his latest piece. "This song is about finding your voice," he said, his hands resting on the piano keys, "and about the people who help you keep it, even when it feels like the world doesn't want to listen." As the first notes filled the room, the audience was captivated, their hearts swelling with the emotion woven into every chord. By the time the final note faded, the standing ovation was thunderous, a testament to how far Caden had come, and how far the community had come with him. The evening ended with Pastor Coleman taking the stage, his deep voice resonating through the hall. "Tonight, we've seen the power of resilience and kindness," he said. "Caden's story reminds us all that change begins with courage. Courage to speak, to listen, and to grow. It's not just about standing up for what's right. It's about lifting each other up along the way." The crowd erupted into applause, their faces lit with hope and determination. Caden's story is a reminder that even in the face of adversity, compassion and courage can bring about meaningful change. What moments in your life have inspired you to stand up for what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting and thought-provoking content. Your support helps us continue to share stories that inspire and unite. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Together, let's continue to spread kindness and empathy in our communities.